The Barren Grounds by David A. Robertson. Chapter 3. Morgan walked Eli to his locker, as she'd done all week, fulfilling a promise she made to Katie and James. Just make sure he's settled, Katie had instructed. He clearly wasn't settled now, though. He carried his ruined illustrations with his head drooped, the intricate expert pencil lines soiled by tire tracks across the paper. Eli's locker was at the far end of the school. Morgan had to pass by her own locker to get to his. It meant that she had to walk the distance of the school, all the way there and all the way back, navigating through swarms of grades 7 and 8s, pushing in one direction or the other. To avoid them, Morgan engaged in a sort of a dance. She wondered if Eli noticed this. How weird did she look, contorting her body to get through the crowds like she was a jewel thief, trying to avoid 1,000 laser beams? Well, here you are, Morgan watched as Eli opened his locker and placed the drawings inside carefully, as if they were made of glass. Eli hung his backpack on one of the hooks inside the locker, then pulled out a binder and a textbook. Math. Morgan had English Language Arts first period. All right, I'll see you at the front doors after school. Morgan moved to leave and then stopped and turned back. Or at lunch. She winced immediately. He had nothing to draw on anymore. I bet if you told Katie and James what would happen, they'd get you a new sketchbook, just like the one you had, she said quickly. Nothing could be like the one I had, he said. Okay, it won't be from your family, but... She trailed off. All settled? Eli nodded. Yeah, sure. When Morgan got to her locker, it was 8:47 a.m. Her class was just across the hall, so with all the time in the world, she stuck her head inside her locker like a middle school ostrich. The more time she could spend there, the fewer students would be around when she crossed the hallway. The contents of Morgan's locker consisted of a neat stack of binders and textbooks, a magnetized mirror on the inside of the door that she used to keep an eye on who was coming behind her rather than to check for zits, a page-sized poster for her favorite band taped to the back of the locker, and her class schedule taped above that. A few minutes passed before Morgan decided it was safe to move. She hung her backpack from a hook and had started to pull out the books and binders she needed for her class, when she spotted someone approaching the mirror. It was Emily Holdsworth. And instead of just walking past Morgan to get to their class, for some reason, Emily stopped. Morgan looked away from her mirror to avoid eye contact because Emily was just standing there. Morgan hoped that Emily would move on, but she didn't. Good morning, Ghost, Emily said. Morgan turned around in a slow motion to face Emily. This was happening, and there was nothing Morgan could do to avoid it. Ghost? Had the other kids given her a nickname? Emily must have read her confusion. I'm just used to giving people nicknames, she said, and then provided a final one-word explanation. Hockey. Right. Morgan had was left to figure out what ghost meant, but wasn't exactly a crazy riddle to solve. Emily looked Morgan over, head to toe. I love those pants. Ripped jeans, Morgan thought. What's to love? They look like authentic rips, Emily said. Not store-bought rips. That's an important distinction. Well played. Thanks. Morgan looked over Emily's wardrobe. She was a short white girl with the physique of a gymnast. She had wavy, dirty blonde hair tied back into a loose ponytail, an ice cube shirt that Morgan was certain was meant to be ironic, a pair of canvas sneakers, and black yoga pants. Morgan felt she should reciprocate, even if Emily didn't look as though she expected it. But she didn't know what to say. Cool shirt, Morgan thought, as if Emily could read her mind. Morgan wasn't sure if Emily talked to her because they were locker neighbors or if Emily was actually just nice. When she dissected it, she thought it was likely the latter. Emily never sounded sarcastic or like talking to Morgan was something she'd been put up to, and the new nickname didn't seem malicious. Emily wore a spring jacket for the AAA hockey team, even when it was hot outside, and she said it like they were teammates. Like Morgan might call Emily something like, Howdsy. Hey, Emily waved her hand in front of Morgan's face. Earth to Ghost. Sorry, Morgan said. That's all right, Emily said. It's like when I see you with one of your books. Totally in another world. It's not that I'm bored of you, Morgan blurted out. Oh, bored of you? Morgan cringed. Was there a hole that she could crawl into? Could she actually stuff her head into the locker? I like your shirt. Thanks. It's ironic, Emily said. Morgan caught herself laughing. Emily looked surprised by it. For some reason, this made Morgan even want to hide more. She checked the time on her phone, 8:56 a.m. We should go and sit down, Morgan said. Did you finish your poem? Emily asked. Yeah. Instead of reading a book last night, she had taken her pink Hilroy scribbler, dusted it off, literally, and worked on it for a few hours in the attic, in the exact spot she usually sat to read. The lights weren't installed up there yet, so she used a mix of moonlight and streetlight. I kind of just threw 4 stanzas together. What? I worked on mine all week. They stopped at the classroom door. I need to get an A. Don't you always get A's? Morgan asked. Emily shrugged. I don't get A's. I don't play hockey, and that's the rule. Morgan put her hand on the doorknob. She could see through the window that the class was full and ready to start. Mrs. Edwards was at her desk shuffling papers. Want to read mine? Emily asked. Why? I just really want to hear yours, Emily admitted. Thought you'd offer. You read so much. You must be awesome at writing. Oh, I don't. Morgan could feel the poem she had written last night stuffed into her back pocket. She'd ripped it out of the Hilroy scribbler that morning and put it there. Just because I read doesn't. I like to write. It's just that. It's all right, Emily said. Don't worry about it. The class door swung open. Morgan had been leaning against it and stumbled inside. It made all the kids break into laughter. Thankfully, Morgan didn't actually fall, but still, damage had been done. Right then, she sure did want to be a ghost. We're about to start, Mrs. Edwards said. The class settled. Emily walked in and announced to their teacher, We were talking about the assignment. Morgan sat in the front of the class beside the windows that overlooked the skating rink in River Heights Community Center. With an empty desk behind her and to the right, she was out of the way. She took a seat and pretended that she couldn't feel kids still looking at her. She pretended she couldn't see them at all. Good morning, Ghost. Mrs. Edwards had platinum blonde hair that fell over her shoulders. She always overdressed for school. Today she was wearing a shiny black sequin dress, as if ELA was at a cocktail party. Her desk was populated by a cupful of pencils and pens, a framed picture of her husband and son, and 10 books neatly arranged at the front, held in place by a wooden-lined bookends. All 10 copies were lyrics to a song, a poetry book that Mrs. Edwards had written. The students lined up to hand in the poetry assignment, and Morgan intentionally went to the back of the line, so by the time she arrived at her teacher's desk, there was already a neat stack of poetry. She reached in her back pocket, pulled out the crumpled piece of paper. Sorry about that, Morgan cleared her throat. Mrs. Edwards picked Morgan's poem up from the pile as if it was a piece of trash. What's this? My poem, Morgan said. I see. Mrs. Edwards slid the poem against the side of the desk repeatedly to trying to flatten it, like it was a bill that the candy machine wouldn't accept. Do you think this is appropriate? Mrs. Edwards asked. No, Morgan whispered. I want to know how much pride you think you have to have in your work, Morgan. I'm sorry, Mrs. Edwards. It won't happen again. You're happy with this? Yes. It wasn't that she hadn't worked hard on the poem. It was just that she had worked hard on it fast. All right, Morgan, Mrs. Edwards sighed. The students were left to watch the last part of a film they started the day before, Finding Forrester, because Mrs. Edwards announced to her students, I just can't wait to read those beautiful pieces. It was like her favorite film, she said last class, because it was about writing and she could relate to it. William Forrester had only ever written one book, and so had she. It's the life of a writer, she explained. Your work is never really done. Some writers get stuck wanting to do something perfect, and once they think they have, well, lightning doesn't strike twice. Morgan wondered if Mrs. Edwards really thought the lyrics to a song fell into that category, but she had to credit her for publishing a book in the first place. Mrs. Edwards was efficient. 10 minutes before class ended, she handed back her poem to their grades, marked in red. Morgan received hers last. It had no ink on it whatsoever. See me after class, Mrs. Edwards whispered to Morgan, with what looked like an apologetic smile. Why? Morgan looked over the poem as though she might find the red letter somewhere, hidden in the folds of a crumpled mark. Just do, she said. When the bell rang and the classroom had emptied, Mrs. Edwards took Morgan's poem and read it silently. Morgan watched her eyes move back and forth, and when finished she handed it back. Is it that bad? Morgan asked. Mrs. Edwards looked up at Morgan and held her eyes for a moment before reciting, "Have all the greatest words been said, then nothing more to do but hush, no phrases honeyed sweet as daisies, nor lines to make the crimson rush." Morgan sat there, hands crossed on the top of the desk. Mrs. Edwards cleared her throat. "Have all the poems been written, then nothing more to do but hide, no shields with rhymes as hard as steel." "I know what it says," Morgan snapped, but caught her tone. "Sorry, Mrs. Edwards, it's just that I know what it says and I thought it was good. Able to write because like everything good has been written already. It's got layers." "Is that what you're passionate about?" Mrs. Edwards asked. "I'm passionate about writing, sure," Morgan said. "Technically the poem's really well done," Mrs. Edwards said. "But Morgan, writing is about the heart, and I'm not feeling that this here. You are so talented, but I can see it, but you don't write it with any heart." "Are you calling me the Tin Man of poetry?" Morgan asked. "Well, if you are, then I guess that makes me the Wizard of Oz," Mrs. Edwards said. "I know you're capable of better, and I'll grade your poem when you've tried again. That's my job as a teacher." "But it isn't fair." Morgan's chest felt hot. "Can't you just give me a B or something? A C plus even?" "Hand something in new by tomorrow. Write from your heart, not your head, and I'll grade that for you," Mrs. Edwards said. Morgan felt like hot all over her body now. She was back at the dining room table, looking at the food made into faces. She wanted to explode. But when she heard Eli's voice asking her why she was mad all the time, she sounded clear, like he was standing right beside her. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath. "I'm not mad all the time." "Pardon me," Mrs. Edwards said. "Nothing. Fine, I'll do it," Morgan whispered. She stuffed the poem back into her pocket and left the room silently, as though she was moving in whispers too.